At Starbound, we like to tell stories the human way, not with artificial slop or AI voices. What's HFY without humanity? So, subscribe if you want to keep it that way. My name is Dan, and let's begin. Why? Asked the human ambassador through the virtual projection at the center of the table in the Galactic Council headquarters. Varzak, the council's president, did not bother to answer immediately. He held a piece of expensive cloth and polished the backward-facing horns that protruded from his green forehead and reached all the way to the back of his skull. He paused to smile, savoring the subtle displays of mirth from the other council members, before finally speaking. "It's not the council's fault that you Death Worlders cannot go a single cycle without involving yourselves in some war," he lied, pretending the council had nothing to do with the fact that they had requested emergency assistance to defend a space mining station, and then failed to arrive with the main fleet, leaving the humans to face the Galactic Empire alone in a war that had nothing to do with them in the first place. In other words, betrayal in its simplest form. The human ambassador said nothing at those words. Instead, his virtual projection turned slowly, coldly, to stare at each council member in turn. The silence stretched like pulled wire. His gaze seemed to confirm whether they too agreed with the words Varzak had just uttered, whether they would all stand united in this lie. Varzak felt a flicker of annoyance. This was taking longer than expected. Humans were supposed to be emotional, impulsive. They were supposed to rage and threaten and make fools of themselves. That was the entire point of this exercise, to provoke their ire, their unsuitability for positions of influence in galactic affairs. Instead, the human was doing something far more disturbing. He was thinking. The projection swiveled to Ziela, the Plick ambassador. Her spindly body stood out in the council's chamber's light. The veins along her neck glowed naturally from her bioluminescence, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. The effect was enhanced even further by her flowing robes, which moved as though touched by an invisible wind. She sat perfectly still under the human's scrutiny, her long fingers drumming once against the armrest of her seat. The human's voice was quiet. "Ambassador Ziela, do you have anything to say?" His eyes were almost piercing her, daring her to lie to his face, just like Varzak had done. Varzak watched as Ziela crossed her long arms across her chest, the veins in her neck flaring brighter for just a moment before she closed her purple eyes. "The Galactic Council had nothing to do with humanity and their wars," she said. "Perhaps your primitive translator devices are to blame. They may have misinterpreted the Council's message as a help request, and you got yourselves into a war for nothing but an old mining outpost." Varzak saw the veins on the human's neck almost burst, the tendons standing out in sharp relief. His gaze became sharp, focused like a predator's at the obvious lie. Yet he didn't explode in anger as Varzak had suspected he would. The president leaned forward, fascinated by this display of restraint. Death Worlders were supposed to be volatile, weren't they? The human turned to Panag, the small, furred Zintab, who sat in a raised seat beside Ziela. The little creature barely reached half the height of the other ambassadors. His whiskers moved up and down, nervously. The human didn't even ask what Panag thought. He simply conveyed, with his gaze, that he wanted to hear what the small creature's opinion was. His head tilted in a gesture that somehow managed to be, at the same time, patient and threatening. Panag's voice was high-pitched, almost squeaking. "The Galactic and humanity are both primitive Death Worlders who got themselves into a full war just because of a minor skirmish in an asteroid belt. An evolved species would be able to find a diplomatic solution." The little creature was gaining confidence now, his chest puffing out. But what can we expect from beings who still experience fear responses and territorial aggression? Your kind simply cannot help yourselves. Then, in a display that made Varzak's eyes widen with delight, Penag stuck out his tongue at the human ambassador, a gesture of profound disrespect in Zintab culture. The small creature held it there, his black eyes glittering. The full council erupted in laughter. Varzak's own deep chuckles mixed with Ziala's tinkling sound and the hissing amusement of the reptilian Sarak ambassador. The insectoid TAC representative made rapid clicking sounds that indicated mirth in his species. Only the human remained still, his expression unchanging. The projection turned to the insectoid and reptilian ambassadors. Ambassador TAC's mandibles clacked together as he spoke, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the chamber's light. Human species show typical Death Worlder paranoia. Council Collective offered support with standard parameters. Human species chose aggressive response to Granok provocation. The Sarak ambassador, his scales a deep crimson that darkened with what Vartak knew was barely concealed contempt, flicked his forked tongue before speaking. The cold-blooded truth, Ambassador, is that your kind seeks conflict. We cannot be held responsible for your nature. The Council acts in the interest of galactic stability, not the vendetta-driven pursuits of warfare-addicted species. The human surveyed every single one of them with his gaze for just a moment. Varzak felt something unexpected, a coldness spreading through his chest, starting from his primary heart and radiating outward. It was unfamiliar and deeply unpleasant. The human's eyes were not filled with rage or desperation or even disappointment. They were calculating, sharp, dangerous. Fine, the human said, his tone making the laughter die in Varzak's throat. Since you forced us into a war, we'll make sure it's one you never forget. The connection terminated. The virtual projection dissolved into sparkling motes of light that faded into nothing. The 5 council members stared at the empty space where the human had stood, then at each other. Varzak found himself uncertain, a rare and uncomfortable feeling. Was that a threat? Ziala asked, her bioluminescent veins blinking rapidly in a display of anxiety. Penag's whiskers froze in place. Empty boasting. What can they do? They're already at war with the Granok. They're trapped. The insectoid and reptilian ambassadors nodded their agreement, though Varzak noticed that Tak's antennae were still quivering. Varzak pushed the cold feeling aside for now. He was the president of the Galactic Council, leader of the most advanced civilizations in known space. He had studied at the finest institutions, earned 3 doctoral degrees in interspecies diplomacy, and served in council positions for 4 decades. He would not be unnerved by a single Death Worlder's parting words, no matter how unsettling they had felt in the moment. He stood, his imposing frame commanding the attention of the others. At nearly 3 meters tall, he towered over everyone except Tak, whose insectoid body consisted mostly of a vertical thorax. His robes, threads of luminescent material woven through the fabric, moved as one with his body. This was the image of authority, of civilized power. The Council has acted correctly, he announced. Consider what we have achieved. The Death Worlders are too dangerous to be left unchecked. Both the Granok Empire and humanity represent existential threats to civilized space, if left to their own devices. He began to pace as he spoke. They are aggressive, competitive, and worst of all, they excel at warfare in ways we cannot match. Our military analysts have made this clear. In any direct confrontation with either species, we would suffer unacceptable casualties. He pulled up holographic displays as he spoke, showing comparative military analyses. The data was damning. Human tactics were numerous and unpredictable. Granic warfare relied on overwhelming force and fearless assault. Either approach, the simulations showed, would devastate Council forces in direct engagement. But now, he spread his arms wide, encompassing the vastness of his vision. Now we have turned these two apex predators against each other. Like directing one plague against another, we have ensured they will consume each other while we remain safely distant. The beauty of it, Varzak continued, warming to his theme, is that both species are too proud, too stubborn to back down. They will fight each other to exhaustion. Whichever side emerges victorious will be weakened, depleted, their resources spent and their populations reduced. At that point, the Council can step in with minimal risk. Ziala's purple eyes opened and she nodded. The President speaks wisdom. We sacrifice nothing while they sacrifice everything. But, Panag interjected, his small voice cutting through the growing confidence in the room. What if they realize what we've done? What if the Granic and the humans somehow put aside their differences and unify against us? Varzak laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed through the chamber. The very idea was absurd. The Granic Empire? Surrender? Compromise? Their entire culture is built on martial honor and conquest. They would rather die to the lost warrior than admit defeat, or, worse, ally with a species they've declared war upon. Their honor code is absolute. To suggest peace while still standing would be the greatest shame imaginable to them. He leaned forward, his hands pressing against the council table. I've studied the Granic for decades. They will fight until they achieve total victory or face total annihilation. There's no middle ground in their culture. And the humans, he snorted. They've been attacked. They've lost ships and personnel. Their politicians are proud. They would rather blame the Granic than admit to their own people that we made fools of them. The council members began to relax, each making their species-specific sounds of agreement. You see, Varzak said, settling back into his seat, the humans are forced to endure this war whether they want to or not. The Granic will accept nothing less than total war. All that is left now is watching the war from the sidelines for the following cycles and betting on who will win and lose. He pulled up the betting interface that had become popular among the council members in recent days. I'm putting the humans will lose within the first 2 cycles. The Granic have larger fleets and centuries of military tradition. Nonsense, Ziala said. The humans have proven resourceful. I say they last 4 cycles before falling. Panag squeaked excitedly. The Granic will crush them in 1 cycle. Their warriors are legendary. The insectoid and reptilian ambassadors added their own predictions, credits being wagered, scenarios being analyzed. The council chamber filled with animated discussion and speculation. Within minutes, they had moved from geopolitical strategy to simple gambling, already forgetting the cold that Varzak had felt inside when the human virtual projection had been staring at him. The president smiled and added his bet to the pool. This was going to be entertaining, at least, and profitable, if he was right about the timeline. A full cycle later, the council sat in silence as they watched the projection of a battlefield. The display showed a sprawling engagement near a contested nebula. Ships from both sides maneuvering in deadly ballet. Explosions bloomed like flowers of light and the tactical readouts scrolled endlessly along the sides of the projection.
"This doesn't match our projections,"
Panag said, his voice lacking its usual confidence.
"Both species' militaries are stronger than before the war. Look at the fleet compositions. Both humans and the Galactic Empire are significantly more powerful than when this started."
"Stronger by how much?" Ziala asked.
"At least 30%,
Panag replied, pulling up comparative data.
"But that's just a temporary spike. It has to be. One of them will suffer a great defeat any day now, and then the decline will begin."
Ziala shook her head, her long fingers manipulating her own data display.
"To me, it looks closer to 50% stronger, for both of them. And that concerns me deeply. If the humans decided to relocate even a fraction of their assets, they could give a serious blow to the Council with a fraction of their full troops."
Varzak slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a thunderclap. The argument ceased immediately. All eyes in the room, from the other 4 individuals, turned toward him. His horns seemed to gleam in the light as he stood, his full height imposing. "The war doesn't look easy for either side," he admitted, his voice controlled despite his frustration.
"But if we positioned our fleet defensively, there's nothing either group can do against us. We maintain the superior strategic position."
He manipulated the central display, adding projections of the Council's defensive fleet positions. The holographic data showed shield networks, patrol routes, and defensive installations forming an impenetrable web around Council space. All of them stared at the projections Varzak added. The data was solid. They could verify it themselves. The Council's combined forces, if deployed in a purely defensive posture, could last several cycles even against a full assault. As long as they didn't engage in offensive operations, as long as they remained behind their fortifications, they were safe. Varzak straightened his robes and allowed himself a smile. "I hereby announce the end of this crisis session. The situation is stable and contained. We will monitor developments, but there's no cause for alarm." The Council members nodded, though Varzak noticed that their relief seemed muted. Incredibly, 10 cycles had passed, and the war between humanity and the Galactic Empire had persisted this long. Varzak stared at all the Council members gathered around the table, and realized with a shock that they had aged visibly. Ziala's bioluminescent veins had dimmed, their glow less vibrant than before. Panag's fur had developed patches of grey that hadn't been there before. Even Tax's carapace looked duller, less polished. None of them had bothered with rejuvenation treatments, despite their availability. The reason was simple. Their species had been pressuring all their leaders to solve the crisis they had created. Varzak himself had faced 3 impeachment proceedings. Ziala had nearly been arrested by her own planetary government. Panag had required constant security escorts to prevent assassination attempts by his own people. Most of them had come very close to being forcibly removed from their positions during the past few cycles. The only reason they still kept their positions was fear. Fear, Varzak thought bitterly, had become the galaxy's primary currency. It had started in the 4th cycle of the war, when humanity revealed its first star destroyer. Not a destroyer that destroyed stars, the name was deceptive, but a warship so massive, so heavily armed, that it could reduce an entire fleet to debris in minutes. The galaxy had trembled in fear. His own impeachment had been delayed when his planet descended into panic. People had stopped showing up to work. The economy had contracted by 15% in a single week. Political upheaval had taken a back seat to existential dread. Then came the 6th cycle. The Galactic Empire revealed FTL warheads that could reach anywhere in the galaxy in mere hours. The technology was revolutionary and terrifying. A weapon launched from Galactic space could strike any world before evacuation was even possible. The missiles could traverse distances that once took months in the span of an afternoon. The galaxy spent days without sleep, all because of the mere existence of such a dangerous weapon. Varzak remembered it with the clarity of trauma. Walking through his capital city at what should have been the busiest hour of the day and seeing the streets empty at noon. Everyone huddled in their homes, glued to news feeds, waiting for the announcement that missiles had been launched, waiting to learn if they had minutes or hours left to live. Stock markets across dozens of worlds didn't just fall, they crashed with such violence that several had to suspend trading indefinitely. The concept of currency itself seemed meaningless when death could arrive faster than the light-carrying news of its launch. 3 governments fell in the panic, their populations turning on leaders who had no answers, no protection, no hope to offer. Citizens began to question the very structure of society. Why go to work if you might not live to see the end of your shift? Why obey laws when the end could come at any moment? For 3 standard days, civilization teetered on the edge of total collapse. And just 1 day later, humanity made their own announcement. They already had the technology. They had possessed it before the Galactic revelation and kept it secret because they wanted to avoid what they described as a galactic stage mad, mutual assured destruction. They had held the weapon in reserve, hoping never to use it, hoping never to spark an arms race. The revelation was somehow worse than the initial shock. The humans had possessed this capability and said nothing. They could have struck any target they wished for months, years perhaps, and no one had known. Ziala's species suffered what the psychologists called stress-induced suicides. 20% of their population, 20%, and not a single missile had been fired toward their planet. They had simply given up. The knowledge that death could come instantly, without warning, without defense, was too much for their psyche to bear. Varzak's own species hadn't fared much better. They had developed an entirely new category of psychiatric medication, anti-existential dread pharmaceuticals. The demand was so high that the medical industry couldn't keep up with production. People waited in lines for hours just to receive their prescriptions. The economy across council space was suffering catastrophically. People weren't working. They couldn't focus. How could anyone concentrate on quarterly reports or production quotas when annihilation could arrive faster than light itself? Productivity had dropped by 60% in some areas, 90% in others. Entire industries had simply stopped. Even the rich, who normally remained isolated from the concerns of common citizens, had abandoned their positions of power. The privileged elite, who had always believed their wealth could protect them from anything, discovered that money meant nothing against weapons that could turn planets to ash. They built bunkers, massive underground complexes, stocked with decades of supplies. They purchased property on distant planets as far from the war as possible. In remote systems, they hoped the Death Worlders would never notice. They hoarded resources against the coming apocalypse with a desperation that would have been amusing if it wasn't so tragic. Varzak's own family had begged him to join them in their bunker. His mate had left with their children 3 cycles ago, moving to a distant colony world in an unnamed system. She had pleaded with him to abandon his position, to choose family over duty. He had refused, not out of nobility, but because he knew the truth. Nowhere was safe. If humanity or the Galactic decided to strike, there was no bunker deep enough, no colony remote enough. The illusion of safety was just that, an illusion. And now, at the 10th cycle of the war, the state of the galaxy was simply broken. This section, The daily security briefing had become a heavy routine. Before the war, the council had met every 5th day. Now, it was daily, sometimes twice daily. Always the same dread, the same reports of new weapons, new capabilities, new reasons to fear. Varzak stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to project authority, but he could feel it slipping. "It will be just a few minutes before the Galactic Empire broadcasts a huge announcement." He laughed, but it was a mad sound, tinged with hysteria. "I bet it's another galactic-scale weapon. And then, in a few days, the humans will announce that they too already have it. And all 5 of us will be forced to go 10 days without sleep again because our populations will be attempting mass suicide or succumbing to mass depression." The words tumbled out faster now, his composure cracking. "Do you remember when we thought we were clever? When we thought we could manipulate these species into destroying each other? How monumentally stupid were we?" He slammed both fists on the table. "Look at what we've become. Look at what the galaxy has become. These super-powerful Death Worlders get stronger by the day while we wither, while we decay, while we lose our minds." Varzak was screaming now, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "And the humans, the Galactic, are they suffering all these psychological effects? No, they're just living their lives, dating, building families, getting jobs, as if the prospect that an enemy alien species could annihilate them from the other side of the galaxy at any moment doesn't affect them at all." He pulled up the human media feeds with a violent gesture, his hands shaking. The holographic display activated at once, showing Earth's most popular news story of the week. A dog being rescued from a flooded area. A dog! A single canine life. Billions of humans were watching footage of a small animal being pulled from rushing water by emergency responders, crying tears of relief and joy, treating it as the most significant event of their news cycle. The video showed the rescue in detail. The brave firefighters wading into dangerous currents, the dog's frightened whimpers, the moment of rescue, the joyful reunion with its family. Humans were posting emotional responses, sharing the video millions of times, donating to animal rescue organizations. It was trending above everything else. Above the war, above the weapons, above the existential threat hanging over the entire galaxy. "A dog!" Varzak shouted, gesturing at the image with a hand that trembled with something between rage and despair. "This is what concerns them. This is what they talk about. Not the war, not the weapons capable of destroying worlds. A single dog." His voice cracked on the last word. He could feel his composure shattering like glass, each piece cutting him as it fell away. He switched to the Galactic Empire's media, the display showing a grand celebration. Thousands of young Galactic warriors gathered in an arena, feasting on the blood of small prey animals they had captured with just their claws and fangs. It was a traditional hunting ceremony, unchanged for millennia, as if nothing else in the universe mattered. "They're celebrating!" Varzak cried, his voice breaking. "They're having festivals! They're conducting business as usual! The greatest war in galactic history is being fought, and they don't even notice! While we're perishing, literally perishing, just from the news of their weapon tests and military engagements!" Tears were streaming down Varzak's face now, cutting tracks through the pigmentation on his green skin. He couldn't stop them. He didn't care anymore. The president of the Galactic Council stood before his peers and wept openly, all pretense of dignity abandoned. The other council members moved to console him. Ziala's long arms wrapped around his shoulders. Benag's small paws patted his arm. Even Tack's mandibles clicked in a soothing rhythm. They all understood. They were all suffering the same psychological torture. When his tears finally stopped, when he had regained enough composure to speak without his voice breaking, Ziala spoke softly. "We must mediate an end to this war. At this point, I believe everyone would be willing to pay any price. The resources, the concessions, whatever it takes. No one can handle this level of stress anymore." Panag nodded vigorously. "My species isn't even reproducing anymore. Birth rates have dropped to near zero. This madness has to stop, or we won't survive to see the war's conclusion." Varzak straightened, wiping his face with his sleeve. In his thoughts, a firm decision crystallized. They would find a way out of this nightmare. They would pay whatever price was necessary. They would beg if they had to. Anything was better than continuing down this path to collective insanity. "We'll begin the peace negotiations immediately," he said hoarsely. "Prepare the diplomatic packages. Offer them whatever they want. Just make it stop." 2 more cycles passed. Cycles spent in desperate diplomatic work, offering concessions that would have been unthinkable before the war. The Council had liquidated strategic reserves, abandoned profitable trade routes, and granted both species access to previously restricted technologies. Anything to bring them to the negotiating table. Anything to make the nightmare end. The cost had been staggering. Varzak had personally signed off on expenditures that exceeded the Council's entire annual budget. Multiple times. They had emptied treasuries, called in favors that had taken centuries to accumulate, and made promises that would take generations to fulfill. All for the chance that humanity and the Galactic might agree to stop fighting. Now, the Council watched the virtual projection in silence, as both humanity's ambassadors and the Galactic Empire's nobles shook hands and smiled on a neutral planet. The peace conference was being broadcast across the galaxy, and every screen showed the same impossible sight. Old enemies laughing together. The conference hall was elegant, neutral, built specifically for this occasion on a world that belonged to neither faction. Architectural elements from both cultures blended seamlessly, a physical representation of the accord being reached. The delegates sat at a round table, humans and Galactic interspersed, their body language relaxed in a way that Varzak found almost obscene. "I swear," one of the Galactic nobles said, his translated voice carrying through the chamber, "when your fleet performed that pincer maneuver at the Helix Nebula, I thought we were finished. My command nearly ordered the self-destruct sequence." The human ambassador laughed. "That was nothing compared to when your dreadnoughts appeared from behind the moon. We almost shot everything. 3 seconds. We were 3 seconds from mutual annihilation." "Ha ha ha! A close call indeed." The Galactic agreed. His expression, alien though it was, clearly showed amusement. "Though I must commend you on your adherence to the warfare conventions regarding civilian targets. Many species would have taken easier paths." "As did you," the human replied. "When you could have struck our colony worlds but chose to engage only military targets, that showed real honor. Not doing what the Galactic Council wanted us to do." One of the Galactic nobles' eyes gleamed with malicious joy. "Ah yes, the Galactic Council. Those cowards who engineered this entire conflict." The human ambassador's smile widened. "Fuck the Galactic Council." Both sides erupted in laughter, as if there was no tomorrow. The humans and Galactic shared some sort of inside joke, some mutual understanding forged in the fires of combat. They clapped each other on the backs, or the nearest equivalent, given their different anatomies, and continued swapping war stories like old friends at a reunion. The council chamber was silent. Varzak looked at his fellow council members and saw his own misery reflected back at him. They looked 10 more years older than they had just 2 cycles ago. The peace negotiations had been grueling. And now they sat there, forced to watch as humans openly cursed the Galactic Council and laughed at them under the eyes of the whole galaxy.
At least,
Panag said weakly,
now that we've used nearly all our resources to get a peace treaty, we'll have our stress-free lives back.
Varzak stared at him. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he began to speak. We need to regulate the Star Destroyers, both the human and Granic versions. They're going to require 18 separate treaty articles, each of which will need to be negotiated, ratified, and enforced. Minimum 5 years for full implementation. He pulled up a holographic list and continued. The FDL warheads need a complete ban framework, verification protocols, inspection regimes, and dismantling schedules. Add another 8 years for that, assuming everyone cooperates. The list scrolled upward as he added more items. The automated defense systems that nearly caused mutual annihilation, those need safety regulations, communication standards, and fail-safe requirements. 3 years? The quantum entanglement communication networks, they're both developed for coordinating fleet movements across light years. They have dual-use capabilities that require monitoring. 4 years. Kinetic bombardment platforms, antimatter production facilities, the genetic engineering programs they both established for creating enhanced soldiers. Each one needs its own regulatory framework. The plasma weaponry needs energy output limitations. The shield technology needs standardization to prevent arms races. The AI targeting systems need ethical guidelines and control mechanisms. Varzak's voice grew more strained as the list continued. The asteroid-based weapons platform, the biological agent countermeasures, the gravitational manipulation technology, the dark matter experiments, the dimensional folding research, the temporal distortion devices they both started developing in the 8th cycle. He paused, looking at the massive list floating before them. Accounting for negotiation time, implementation periods, verification systems, and enforcement mechanisms. I estimate it will take half a century to finish all the treaties and regulations needed so that our own species can sleep peacefully again. The council chamber fell into stunned silence. Varzak looked at each of them in turn. And that's assuming they cooperate. That they don't develop new technologies while we are still regulating the old ones. That they don't find loopholes or workarounds. That they actually care about what we think anymore, which, given what we just witnessed. He gestured at the still-playing footage of humans and Granic laughing together. Seems unlikely. He sat down heavily in his chair, his horns gleaming dully in the chamber's light. A thought occurred to him, bitter and final. How incredibly foolish it was to betray humanity. How expensive, in both credits, time and stress, it had turned out to be, this lesson about why humans invented war and how well they could thrive in it. They had just survived a war with another apex predator species. They had grown stronger. They had forged an understanding, perhaps even the beginning of a friendship, with beings who should have been their mortal enemies. Meanwhile, the Galactic Council, the most advanced civilizations in known space, the enlightened species who had congratulated themselves on their clever manipulation, had crumbled. Their economies were shattered. Their populations were traumatized. Their resources were depleted. And they faced half a century of desperate diplomatic work just to restore a fraction of the security they had possessed before their brilliant plan. They had spent 12 cycles learning lessons written in human blood and Granic honor. They had learned what humanity could really do. They had learned how Death Worlders could thrive in conditions that broke civilized minds. They had learned that there were species in the galaxy who could stare into the abyss and then go about their day without flinching. Varzak closed his eyes and finally understood what the human's cold stare had meant 12 cycles ago. You just made a terrible mistake.